Israel was created in 1948, and those people who had been aiming for that goal, known as political Zionists, for the preceding decades were very clear that they were going to go through a process of ethnically cleansing the indigenous population in Palestine. You had David Ben-Gurion, a political Zionist from Poland, whose original name was David Green, and he became the first prime minister of Israel. But over a decade before that, before 1948, he clearly said in letters to his son, "We must expel the Arabs and take their places." Is that banging me? Is that...
Yeah, I think it's...
Keep it a bit further away? Okay. "We must expel the Arabs and take their places." I'm quoting from these letters. You have Benny Morris, a current-day Zionist Israeli historian who confirms that, and I'm quoting. He said, "Ben-Gurion was right. Without the uprooting of the Palestinians, a Jewish state would never have emerged here." So this idea of like acquiring as much land as possible while ridding it of as much of the indigenous population as possible has a term, has a modern-day name. It's ethnic cleansing. And to be clear, the ideological birth mother of the State of Israel is settler colonialism. And settler colonialism is the worst form of colonization because it involves exactly that, acquiring as much land as possible while ridding it of as much of the indigenous population as possible. You had Vladimir Jabotinsky, one of the foremost Zionist leaders, as far back as 1923, in his famous essay, The Iron Wall, where he says, and I'm quoting here, "Zionist colonization, even its most restricted, must either be terminated or carried out in defiance of the will of the native population." So he called it how it was. And this guy is a national hero. There are more streets named after him in Israel than any other famous person has named after them anywhere in the world. So the establishment of the State of Israel was through ethnic cleansing. It involved the violent displacement of several 100,000 Palestinians, indigenous Palestinians. The numbers put it around 700,000 men, women, and children, which in 1948 was a huge number, and it constituted a huge percentage of the population. Now, from the earliest days of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine by Zionist forces, the newly established Israeli state went to enormous efforts to ensure that they would prevent the expelled Palestinians from ever being able to return. Even when they came back to sort of collect their belongings or tend to their crops, they were either shot down dead or rounded up and dumped again on the other side of the nearest border. In an attempt to erase Palestinian history and further deter Palestinians, those expelled Palestinians, from ever returning, the Israeli authorities demolished 500 villages and towns and or renamed them and handed them to newly arrived Jewish-only immigrants. Likewise, entire neighborhoods were handed, these beautiful carved stone ancient homes were handed to newly arrived Jewish-only immigrants from mostly Europe and Russia. Some of these houses, even with the food sitting on the stove where the Palestinians had left it when they fled. Because, to be clear, when the Palestinians were essentially chased out of their lands and fled, they truly believed they'd be back in a couple of weeks. They packed small bags. Some even buried their jewelry in their gardens, and they locked the doors with their keys, and they headed to safety. My husband's grandmother, as an example, she hid her jewelry and her precious belongings in a sort of secret cabinet in their home in Haifa, locked the door and fled. Now, not everyone was that lucky. I mean, this is the lucky version. You had others who stayed behind, who wanted to fight to protect their properties and their homes, and to protect the old and the sick who couldn't flee. Then there were those who were held at gunpoint and ordered to leave, and literally left with the clothes on their back, some barefoot, walking all the way to Lebanon or Jordan, barefoot. And then you had those who were massacred in their villages. But those who got word of these massacres in fear packed up their families and headed to safety, truly believing that they would be returning in a couple of weeks, in a matter of weeks. So in 1948, the State of Israel, quite simply, could not have been created as a Jewish state. Well, let's put it this way. It was through ethnic cleansing, and it literally involved the seizing of lands, homes, and properties that amounted to a multi-billion-dollar theft that could only be maintained if the original owners are prevented from returning. In 1967, during what we know as the Six-Day War, again, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were, driven from their homes and made into refugees, which brings us to where we are today, where those refugees and their descendants amount to 6 million Palestinians who remain stuck in squalid refugee camps in Gaza, the West Bank, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. And to be clear, those of Gaza and Syria have been made refugees, some of them 2-3 times over. They've been displaced more than once. The camps are usually extremely poor and extremely crowded, with very limited resources, amenities, opportunities. I have visited a number of these camps, and they are horrible places. Generations of Palestinians are literally living on handouts from aid agencies, while their former homes and lands are quite literally being lived in and cultivated by Israelis. Now, to be clear, the right of return for Palestinians known as al-Haq al-Awda is not unique to Palestinians. The right of return is for every refugee. It's a universal right that is clearly and unambiguously guaranteed in international law, and it applies to all displaced people, and so of course applies to Palestinians. But more specifically for Palestinians, in 1948, December 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 194. Again, in 1967, a few days after the Six-Day War I just mentioned, they passed Resolution 237, both calling on Israel to facilitate the return of refugees. So the right of return, a cornerstone of the Palestinian struggle, is the principle that Palestinian refugees and their descendants have an inalienable right to return. Yet, as we see, a refugee population of 6 million Palestinians, now 70 years on after the creation of the State of Israel, are being excluded from returning to their homes by Israeli state discrimination. Meanwhile, you can be a Jew born New York, Belgrade, Timbuktu, and according to Israeli law, you have a birthright. You're born and raised in these places. You have no connection to Palestine and Israel, but you have a birthright according to Israeli law, and are considered a national, and can be made a citizen almost immediately upon immigration because you were a Jew. So Israeli law makes it very easy for Jewish people from all over the world to become Israeli citizens, yet almost impossible for Palestinians of non-Jewish descent, who were the original inhabitants, descendants, indigenous population, to ever return. Now, this all begs the question, of course, why doesn't Israel allow Palestinians to return, Palestinian refugees to return, which I think will be covered at some point, and if it's not, we can come back. But whatever Israel's Jewish-only interests are, or the demographic threats that they might perceive, and demographic threats, again, something we can come back to, Palestinians have a right to return that is well established in international law, regularly reaffirmed by the United Nations, firmly grounded in international humanitarian law, refugee law, human rights law, all the way from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to the Fourth Geneva Convention. Now, unfortunately, the United States has been blocking any means or any action that the UN can take to uphold these rights, while now recently simultaneously reducing the funding to those aid agencies that support the refugees. Israel, on the other hand, refuses to even bring up the sort of right of refugees in any peace negotiations, which has always been an impediment to peace negotiations, because as you can clearly see, it's a major issue. It involves the fate of millions of Palestinians and can't simply be just dismissed or ignored. It should be understood, though, that if the right of Palestinians to return was upheld, it doesn't mean that every Palestinian would return. They should be given the option, of course. And there are options also for compensation and local integration of where they are. There's compensation and third country resettlement. But Israel refuses to acknowledge that these refugees even exist, let alone discuss a sort of portion of them returning and the rest being offered compensation. They prefer to sort of deny the refugees' rights entirely, to the extent of being in denial that the 1948 expulsions even took place. But that rallying cry, a land without a people for a people without a land without a people for a people without a land, that Zionists created for external international consumption to essentially hide their crimes, that can clearly be seen now to have been pure sophistry, purely deceitful. Everyone can see, with 6 million refugees still remaining stateless in squalid refugee camps, that is not true. That historic Palestine, 78% of which you now know to be Israel, historic Palestine was a land with a people. Which is why, by the way, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement has the right of return as one of its main pillars, one of the 3 main objectives, because the creation of the State of Israel was quite literally built on the devastation, destruction, and dispossession of those Palestinians that became refugees. Early Israeli leaders, they sort of comforted themselves with the mantra, the old will die and the young will forget. They are right that the living memory of pre-1948 Palestine is dying, with the oldest of the refugees now more than 70 years old. And their children know only stories. But those stories and the injustice that their elders endured, and that they are currently enduring as refugees themselves, live in the hearts of millions of Palestinians who are coming on 4 generations now of being denied any access to their homeland. They have not forgotten. So that's it from me for now.